The rain poured relentlessly. Outside the massive glass windows of the Kingston estate, streaking down like silent tears against the dark sky. Inside, the mansion was warm, luxurious, and seemingly perfect. Just like the life of billionaire entrepreneur Richard Kingston. At least, that's what the world believed. Tall, broad-shouldered, and devastatingly handsome, Richard was the picture of success. He had built an empire from the ground up, owned multiple businesses, and had a wife that turned heads at every gala. Yet, despite all of it, a hollow ache sat deep in his chest, a feeling he had ignored for years. Downstairs, moving gracefully through the kitchen, was Eleanor, a woman who had spent the last 4 years as the Kingston's maid, a quiet beauty with deep brown skin and intelligent, watchful eyes. She carried herself with the quiet dignity of someone who had learned to expect little but work hard for everything. She was devoted to her job, but more than that, she understood people. She had seen the cracks in the Kingston marriage long before anyone else had. Richard's wife, Victoria, was breathtaking, blonde, elegant, with a presence that demanded attention. She was the perfect socialite, always draped in designer labels, always surrounded by admirers. But there was something cold about her, something that Elena had noticed long ago. The way she avoided Richard, the way she smiled at him in public, but barely spoke to him at home. And then, of course, there were the phone calls, the late-night meetings, and most telling of all, the scent of another man's cologne that sometimes lingered on her expensive silk dresses. Elena never intended to get involved. It wasn't her place. She was just the help. But fate has a way of pulling people into situations they never expect. And on one fateful evening, she stumbled upon a truth that could shatter everything. It happened by accident. She had been gathering laundry from the bedroom when she heard muffled voices coming from the walk-in closet. The door wasn't fully shut, and before she could stop herself, she caught a glimpse of Victoria, her arms wrapped around a man who was most definitely not Richard. It was Marco, the gym instructor who had been coming to the mansion for months, his muscular frame pressed against Victoria's as she laughed softly, whispering words that made Elena's stomach twist. Elena's breath caught in her throat. She knew secrets lived in this house, but to see it so clearly, so shamelessly, it was something else entirely. For days, she wrestled with the knowledge. Should she tell Richard? Would he even believe her? What if Victoria turned the tables and accused her of lying? It wasn't just her job on the line. It was her entire livelihood. But the more she saw Richard, the way his eyes looked distant, the exhaustion he carried on his shoulders, the more she knew she had to do something. One evening, as Richard sat alone in his study, a glass of whiskey untouched beside him, Elena hesitated in the doorway. "Mr. Kingston," she said gently. He looked up, surprised. She rarely spoke unless it was work-related. "Yes, Elena," she swallowed hard, her hands twisting together. "I need to tell you something, and it's not easy." Richard frowned, sitting up. "Go on." And so, with her heart pounding, she told him everything, every detail she had seen, every suspicious moment she had noticed. When she finished, the silence in the room was deafening. Richard stared at her, his jaw tightening, his fingers clenching into fists. At first, he didn't want to believe it. It was too much, too painful. But deep down, he knew. He had known for a while, hadn't he? He just never wanted to face it. The betrayal burned through him. And for the first time in years, he felt something other than numbness. But even in that moment of anger, there was something else. A quiet gratitude toward the woman standing in front of him. Elena had no reason to put herself at risk by telling him the truth. She had nothing to gain from it, and yet she did it anyway. What Richard didn't know yet, what neither of them knew, was that this revelation would change everything. Not just his marriage, not just his life, but his heart. Because sometimes love doesn't come in grand gestures or fairy tale moments. Sometimes it finds you in the quietest places, in the most unexpected people. And Richard Kingston was about to discover that the person who saw him most clearly had been right in front of him all along. The silence between Richard and Elena stretched on, thick with unspoken emotions. Richard leaned back in his chair, exhaling slowly as the weight of the truth settled over him. His mind raced. Flashes of memories, small moments he had dismissed, all now falling into place. The coldness in Victoria's touch, the distant look in her eyes, the way she always found a reason to be away from home. It wasn't just business trips or social events. It was betrayal, hidden in plain sight. Elena stood still, hands clasped in front of her, afraid she had crossed a line she couldn't take back. But when Richard finally looked up, his expression wasn't one of anger toward her. It was something else. Pain, yes, but also gratitude. "Why did you tell me?" he asked, his voice quiet. She hesitated. "Because you deserve to know the truth," she admitted. "And because I couldn't stand watching you live in a lie." Her words struck him in a way he hadn't expected. He had spent years convincing himself that love meant compromise, that marriage meant enduring the empty spaces between him and Victoria. But now, he wasn't sure what was real anymore. That night, Richard barely slept. He lay awake, staring at the ceiling, memories of his wife playing like a broken reel in his mind. Every "I love you" that now felt like a lie. Every time he had trusted her, only to realize she had been giving herself to someone else. And then there was Elena, the woman who had no reason to involve herself, yet had risked everything to be honest with him. The next morning, Richard confronted Victoria. He didn't raise his voice or lash out. He simply told her what he knew. At first, she denied it, laughing coldly, calling him paranoid. But when she saw the way he looked at her, so sure, so steady, her face changed. The mask slipped. "So what if I did?" She finally spat, crossing her arms. "What difference does it make? You and I haven't been in love for years, Richard. You were too busy building your empire to notice." Her words were sharp, meant to wound, but Richard only felt a strange sense of clarity. She was right about one thing. Their love had died long ago, but that didn't justify her betrayal. "We're done, Victoria," he said, his voice calm but firm. For the first time, she seemed caught off guard. "You're serious?" "Yes," Victoria scoffed, tossing her hair over her shoulder. "Fine, but don't expect me to go quietly." The divorce was inevitable, but it wasn't going to be easy. Victoria was ruthless, determined to make Richard pay for walking away. She wanted the house, the money, the power. The media caught wind of their split, and soon, headlines painted Victoria as the heartbroken wife, while Richard was cast as the cold, distant husband who had let his marriage fall apart. Through it all, Elena remained in the background, silently supporting Richard in ways she never expected. She kept the house running as the chaos unfolded, ensuring he had a space to breathe when everything outside felt suffocating. But more than that, she was simply there. Some nights, Richard found himself lingering in the kitchen just to talk to her. Their conversations started as small moments, talking about work, about the weather, about anything but the mess he was in. But soon, they became something deeper. Elena saw him in a way no one else did. Not as the billionaire, not as the man in the headlines, but as someone who was hurting, who was learning to rebuild. And Richard, in turn, found himself drawn to her warmth, her quiet strength. One evening, as they stood on the balcony overlooking the city lights, Richard turned to her. "You've always been honest with me, Elena. Can I ask you something?" She looked up at him, the cool breeze brushing against her skin. "Of course." He hesitated, then asked, "Do you think I deserve this?" Elena studied him for a moment before shaking her head. "No," she said softly, "but I think sometimes life has a way of breaking things apart to show us where we're really meant to be." Her words lingered in his mind, long after she had walked away that night, because deep down, he knew she was right, but neither of them were ready to admit what was slowly unfolding between them. The way Richard found himself looking forward to their late-night talks. The way Elena's heart skipped a beat whenever he said her name. Yet, just as Richard started to find clarity, another storm was brewing. Victoria wasn't done. She had been humiliated, and she wasn't about to let Richard move on so easily. One morning, Richard found himself at the center of yet another scandal. Photographs surfaced in the tabloids. Pictures of him and Eleanor standing close, talking in hushed tones. The headlines screamed accusations. Millionaire's affair with Maid. Who's the real cheater in this divorce? It was all orchestrated. Victoria had planted the story, twisting the truth to make herself the victim once again. And now, Elena, who had done nothing but tell the truth, was being dragged into the public eye. She stood in the kitchen, staring at the magazine spread, her hands shaking. I should go," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "I don't want to cause more trouble for you." Richard stepped closer, his expression unreadable. "You think I care about what they say?" She looked up at him, her eyes filled with uncertainty. "The world is going to believe whatever they want, and you don't need another scandal." He exhaled, rubbing his temples. "Eleanor, you are not a scandal." His voice was firm, filled with something she hadn't expected, something that made her heart ache. "But I'm not like her," she said, shaking her head. "I don't belong in your world." Richard studied her for a long moment before speaking. "Maybe my world is exactly what needed to change." For the first time, the lines between them blurred. They weren't just a billionaire and a maid. They weren't just two people caught in a storm. They were something more. And as the tension built, as the world around them threatened to pull them apart, neither of them could deny the truth any longer. Something had started between them. Something real. Something neither of them had been prepared for. But was it strong enough to survive everything coming their way? Elena had always been careful, always stayed in the background, never wanting to be noticed. But now, her face was splashed across every gossip site. Her name whispered in scandal. People she had never met were suddenly picking apart her life, her intentions, twisting the truth into something ugly. She had expected Richard to distance himself, to protect his reputation. After all, this wasn't her world. She was just a maid, an outsider caught in the storm of his high-profile divorce. But instead of stepping away, he did the one thing no one expected. He stood beside her. The very next day, Richard called a press conference. Cameras flashed wildly as reporters shouted questions, eager to hear his side of the story. But he didn't play their game. He didn't give them a rehearsed statement or vague denials. Instead, he spoke with the quiet confidence of a man who had finally stopped hiding. "The rumors about Elena and me are just that. Rumors," he said firmly. "She is not the reason my marriage ended. The truth is, my marriage was over long, before I found out about my wife's affair. And the only mistake Elena made was telling me the truth, when no one else would." The reporters kept pressing, trying to dig up dirt, trying to turn it into something more. But Richard didn't waver. "She is not a scandal," he repeated. "She is someone I trust, someone who showed me more honesty and kindness than I've known in years." The media frenzy didn't die down overnight, but Richard's words changed the narrative. People started seeing the truth, that Elena wasn't the villain Victoria had tried to make her out to be. And as the divorce battle dragged on, it became clear that Victoria had played her last card. She had lost. Days turned into weeks, and slowly life settled. The headlines faded, the cameras moved on, and for the first time in a long time, Richard felt something unfamiliar: peace. One evening, he found Elena on the balcony again, the city lights stretching out before her. She looked so lost in thought that she didn't hear him approach. "Do you regret telling me?" he asked softly. She turned, surprised. "No," she said after a pause. "But I didn't expect things to turn out like this." Richard studied her, his gaze filled with something deeper than gratitude. "Neither did I." A long silence passed between them, the kind that didn't need words. Then, cautiously, Richard reached for her hand. She didn't pull away. "Eleanor, I don't care about the world's expectations. I don't care about the past. I just know that when everything fell apart, you were the only person who stood by me. And I don't want to imagine my life without you in it." She looked up at him, emotions flickering in her deep brown eyes. "Are you sure?" Richard gave a small, almost disbelieving laugh. "For the first time in a long time. Yeah, I'm sure." Elena had spent years learning to keep her heart guarded, to never hope for things beyond her reach. But standing there, looking at the man who had once been so far above her world, and yet now felt so close, she allowed herself to believe. The storm had passed, the past was behind them, and in its place, something new was beginning, something neither of them had planned, but both of them were finally ready for. Maybe love wasn't about grand gestures or perfect timing. Maybe it was about the people who stayed when everything else crumbled. And as Richard pulled her gently into his arms, Elena knew this wasn't the end of the story. It was just the beginning.